And great. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you. My name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Tim.
Uh, I think I went to sleep halfway through that reading, but very well done, everyone. Um, Not everyone that is here was necessarily at the any of the earlier sessions, and if they were, well, it's not certain that everything's been remembered. So I'm going to cover a little bit of background to concept 7. So the deal is this. Uh, for AA to get stuff done as a fellowship as a whole, uh, you need offices, you need people running those offices, you need directors running that. And above them sit a board of directors who meet very regularly, but are not there permanently. So they, as it were, oversee the operations, but they're very heavily involved. Although they're volunteers, those board members work exceptionally hard, and really, I think they give up. Uh, if you added up the number of hours, a good 3 to 4 months of their year on being board members. They're not permanent. The staff are permanent, and the committees are constantly active. But that uh, degree of commitment by the board members is totally adequate to run the corporation, although uh, there are big decisions which need to be made. It's not like you're in a sort of fast moving retail sector or something where everyone needs to have their finger on the pulse the whole time. So that works very well. Now the question is, these directors, the board members, um, how are they accountable to the fellowship? And that's the tricky bit, because the fellowship is you and me sitting in Kings Langley or Oban or Aberystwyth or somewhere. They obviously can't phone up all of us one by one and say, what do you think about this? So we have a chain of delegation going from the individuals through to the GSRs, through to the intergroups, the regions, the delegates, and the conference. And the conference does two things, really. It um, figures out what the fellowship would like the board to do, amongst other things. It figures out things for itself as well. It discusses things really as the voice of the whole fellowship. But out of that discussion comes some recommendations to the board. So that's the first thing they do. The second thing they do is they scrutinize to some extent. They scrutinize the actions of the board as reported on in the various reports that the board produces. So they're giving recommendations to the board. They're also uh, acting as a sort of supervisor of the board. I mean, in practice, alcoholics are not great readers. If you've ever given a sponsee instructions, you'll discover that most people can't read. Um, they just don't see the words on the page. They see something that they want to see there. And the board produces a lot of material to read, and I think it's questionable how much genuine scrutiny uh, is exercised by the conference delegates over the board. But there are always a few bright sparks at conference. You don't need many for this to work. There are a few bright sparks who do read things and do ask questions. Having been at conference, I can report that very often the board members are not able to answer the questions, but the questions are asked and they're on the record, and they sometimes will get answered later on. But the very fact that the board know there are going to be some sharp shooters at conference, usually from continental Europe region and London, and the southwest as well is particularly vocal. And the Highlands and Islands, no one knows why. Rebels, maybe. Non-conformists up there. That's where you get the most challenging voices. The fact that that mechanism is there, I think, is sufficient to keep the board in line. because they know that they're going to have to report on what they're doing and everything comes out eventually. So that's what closes the circle. Now, the conference is there once a year. Chiefly, there are some things which the conference does in between, but not many. And so you've got not an ordinary balance of power. It's not like a line manager and the person that is being supervised and with the line manager looking over their shoulder the whole time. Imagine a line manager who's only there once a year. That's the relationship you've got between the conference and the board. So there are mechanisms in place for the conference to be able to exercise its power over the board. And that takes two forms. The first one is through the conference's actual votes. And so if the conference votes a simple majority in favour of something, this is in Article 4 of the conference charter. I know because I read it. That's why they wrote it down so we can read it, you see. In Article 4, it says, if you've got a simple majority, then that's a recommendation to the board. If it's 2/3, it's binding, which means they have to do it. There's a caveat there. I'll come to that. And with 3/4, they can reorganize the board. They can request a resignation and they can propose new board members. Now, the difficulty legally is the board is they're I think the directors of the company, which in Great Britain is also a registered charity. So, and they have employees. So you've got company law, you've got employment law, you've got charity law, you've got any other laws which apply to organizations generally. But those are the three chief areas: company law, employment law, and charity law. And the board, they cannot breach the law simply because conference recommends thus. And also, I think I'm right in saying I'm not I'm not an expert on the legal for the legalistic side, but my understanding is that the conference can't have any absolute power over the board because they are these trustees. They're running a legal entity, and the legal entity must be, as it were, freestanding. It can't be subject to external influences which override its own decision making because they're the ones who are liable under the law for what they're doing. So this is where concept 7 comes in. The board, in a material sense, in a legal sense, are bound by the law. But you've got tradition and you've got the power of the purse, which means that the conference is really in charge ultimately. So for almost everything, the board just gets on with it. This traditional power that the conference has, it's understood by the board in principle, at any rate, that they're there to do what the fellowship wants in terms of large matters of general policy and finance. And that's the ethos. That's what it means by traditional power. The traditional power is also enshrined in the system of recommendations, binding recommendations, and the ability of the conference to reorganize the board. So it's in there as well. But also, if something goes frightfully wrong, the board literally can't do anything as a company unless it has money, and the money must come from the members. So if the board gets too far out of line, goes off, as lawyers would say, on a frolic of its own, then the fellowship, as has happened on occasion, various bits of the fellowship have withheld funds Nobody likes conspiracy theory as much as an alcoholic, and you get two in a room. My golly, believe anything. Now, sometimes these situations where a particular region, I'm not going to go into details, but a particular region has withheld funds. Sometimes there's a very legitimate grievance. Other times there's a lot of miscommunication going on, misunderstanding. But the mechanism is there, and there's the incentive to sort it out, whether the issue is genuine or whether the issue has arisen through miscommunication. The fact is, if particularly certain regions withhold their funds, the board is stuffed. So there are these levers of power that the fellowship as a whole, acting through the conference, has over the board. How this can apply in life. In any family unit, if you live on your own and you're accountable just to yourself, then concept 7 doesn't really apply. But it does start to apply if you operate as part of a family unit with more than one person. And there are certain questions where there are decisions where an individual must make, which other people will have legitimate input on, but the final decision must be the person's. And that's really what you've got, the relationship between the conference and the board. The board has to make the final decision. It is the one that is that has responsibility, that has authority, that has accountability under the law. But they need to listen. And so you've got questions within the family of personal finances. If someone's personal, for instance, if someone has a gambling addiction, and just a footnote on healthy financial relations within a family unit, it's very, very helpful to have, let's say there are two of you, to have three pools of money. One pool of money is the shared pool of money, which is used to run the household. Each person makes their contribution into that once a month by direct debit, and then people have their own private stash with anything else left over from their income. But the first thing you do with the income, the first slice that comes off it goes into the joint account to run the household. Then each person can turn a blind eye to what the other person does with their private spending. That will solve about 98% of family arguments about money. Anyway, if you have that system and someone's not able to contribute to the pot, that individual is responsible for themselves, but boy, do they have to listen to everyone else. Similar situations arise where whether someone takes a job, that is ultimately their decision. The family cannot and shouldn't override that, but they must listen to the impact that the taking of that job will have on the family. There are other situations where there's very definitely a much stronger legal responsibility. For instance, if you're a family and one person has a very elderly relative, and the question is, should that person be moved to a care home? The person who has signed the lasting power of attorney, they are the ones that will make the decision in that regard, or other decisions about the very elderly parent. If both people are on it, fine. But if only one is on it, that person is the one who is liable. Similarly, if the house is in one person's name, if the owner of the house is sued, they are the one that must decide what happens in terms of fighting the legal action, because the house is in their name, the assets are in their name, they must have the final decision. But listen to the family. If you don't listen to the family, the whole thing collapses. So there has to be there's a subtle balance there. So a point I'm wondering whether to go into it. It's excessively complicated, so I won't bother. I'm going to talk about the application of concept 7 spiritually. So in the material, you see you've got the material world and the realm of the spirit. what is spirituality? What is the spirit? Is it anything which is not material? And to give a very specific example, if you see a sunset, there is something physically going on. Your appreciation of that does not reside in the material world. That resides in the realm of the spirit because it cannot be measured. When it comes to my finances, my business, my legal responsibilities, I am the one who is legally, financially, materially, and practically liable for everything. I have absolute responsibility there in a material sense. I can't go to court and say, well, I'm just doing what my higher power wants me to do. That's no defense. So in the material world, the buck stops with me. I have to act like everything depends on me. However, my little secret is that everything that I do in the world comes from God. The opportunities come from God. The abilities come from God. What I have is not absolute authority and responsibility and accountability for anything in my life. It's very quietly delegated by God. I have delegated authority. I have delegated responsibility. So if you think about it like this, if there's a parent and a child, and the parent gives the child sixpence to spend to go to the shop to buy something with its sixpence, the sixpence, although it appears to be the child's to spend, the child is really spending it on behalf of the parent. It's not its own money. When it goes into the shop and spends its sixpence, as far as the man behind the counter is concerned, it's the child's sixpence. But the truth is that it belongs to the father, and that's the relationship with anything in my life, that I'm the custodian of these things. So I crack very easily under the pressure of the ego. If I feel psychologically and spiritually that all of these matters and concerns and occupations and affairs and so on in my life, that if I felt I had final and ultimate responsibility and authority and accountability for those, I would pop in 5 minutes. Can't do it. What the program suggests is I'm just a custodian. I turn up every day, I do God's will, and then I'm done. So all of that stuff is entrusted to me. I'm the custodian, I'm the guardian, and even what to do comes from God. The what to do and the how to do it. If you think about what Concept 7 says, the conference provides two things to the board. It provides guidance on what to do, and it provides the resources to do it from the fellowship. I mean, in practice, the regions are sending it independently, or the intergroups are sending it independently. But essentially, the fellowship is providing the resources to the board through the conference. And there's a parallel here between Concept 7 and Step 11. Step 11, praying only for knowledge of God's will for me and the power to carry that out, what to do and the ability to do it. The fellowship provides to the board what to do and the ability to do it, the tradition and the power of the purse. So it's exactly the same thing. And so my job is just to get on with it. The results, I report the results back to God, and then God tells me what to do. I don't hold the results to myself, just like the board reports once a year to the conference. So I report to the higher power, then it's out of my hands, I'm free. And God's will for me is to be happy, joyous, and free, not burdened. If I feel frightened, if I feel heavy, if I feel weighed down, if I feel anxious, I'm holding on to things that I should either be giving to God in terms of what to do, or the securing of the resources to do it, or the results. I must report the results back as soon as possible and then let everything go. Then I can be absolutely free. And what this really means is the board has to trust the conference. So the conference trusts the board to get on with it, but the board trusts the conference that it knows best on behalf of the fellowship. So God trusts me. Uh, God will do for me what I cannot do for myself, but won't do for me what I can do for myself. If I can do something, it's my job to do it. If I can't do something, it's not my job to do it. Someone says, but what is God's will for me? It's what is simple, it's what is practical, and it is what is possible. If it's not possible, it's not God's will. If it's not practical, it's not God's will. If it's not simple, it's not God's will. If I feel agitation, emotional disturbance, or if I feel doubt, I don't know what to do. The problem is I've severed the link between me and God in concept 6 and 7, and it needs to be re-established. Go straight to God. Bottom of page 87. What is the right thought? What is the right action? Reminding myself I'm no longer running a show, saying many times each day thy will be done. And that's the ideal for the board, that if it doesn't know what to do, ask conference for the right thought or action. Remind itself it is not running AA, the conference is running AA. Ultimately, God is running AA, and conference is the voice of God through tradition too. It's no longer running the show. The board is not running the show. And AA's will be done and God's will be done. And if I apply this pair of concepts which go together, concept 6 and concept 7 in my life, there's no need for any anxiety or worry or anything, because I've got a mechanism for just getting on. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to suggest maybe we keep the recording on for any, if there are any questions or answers. It may not be, but there we go. That's what I've got on that.
Thank you, Tim. That's fantastic. Does anyone have any questions for Tim? Please put your hands up or just come in. Don't all rush at once. I mean, well, I can start with something. So I want to ask you, Tim, how do you feel about, I mean, if I say something that's actually happened, but I make it sort of an anonymous sort of thing, how do you feel about that? So
Yeah,
as an
just
example,
remember
yeah.
so once something is recorded,
Mm.
it goes out there. So just
Well,
be careful how
yeah,
you
I
express
will.
it.
But okay, so basically we had a situation where there will be a question at the end of this where um the board were running the service office in a fellowship I attend, and there's weak kind of like processes in place to look take care of the checks. They were spending checks, and some checks got stolen and spent on alcohol and drugs. And the area, I suppose you would call it a region in AA terms, stopped sending money to its world service because they wanted to make sure there were proper things in place so that the checks would be carefully looked after and cashed appropriately. And also we were very keen to get a receipt from the World Service Board, so that saying that they had received our money, because we hadn't got that. So that always brought about some fear. So is that a good example of the power of the purse? Can you think of any others? Can anyone else think of any others? It can be at group level, it can be at intergroup level. I'm trying to make it really super practical. Do you think that's a good use of concept 7 or not? Probably not.
No, I'm just thinking. Yeah, I think that's right. So that the uh, whether it's a board which operates through a corporation,
Mm.
or whether it's a region committee or an intergroup committee, it's very often said in service. I've heard this said a lot, that the money that intergroup is looking after is not its money, it's AA's money. And the most important thing with money in AA is to have shared responsibility, so that checks can't be. I mean, if you have fraud with people colluding, you can do anything. But essentially, the safeguard against fraud is the fact that two people need to sign the check or authorize the payment in the online bank. one must always keep very good records, which means a very good thing for a group to do, for instance, is to have the finance folder on the front table saying in big words, finance, because then everyone knows it contains finance stuff. Not hidden in the box with attention drawn to it, which shows the rent receipts. If you have rent receipts and the rent receipts are up to date and the accounts add up and you're not keeping anything more than 2 months of operating expenses as your prudent reserve, AA keeps 2 years plus working capital. The difference between the prudent reserve and the working capital, the prudent reserve, as far as I'm aware, is 2 years of operating expenses. The working capital covers the board and its corporation for ups and downs in income and expenditure over the course of the year. So you need a bit of a float as well as the prudent reserve. So you need to calculate at any level a little bit of both. You need to make sure that you have a prudent reserve plus with the ups and downs, you've got to know what the timing of the payments is. But anyway, the point is that the accounts must be up to date. And if you're not keeping any more than the prudent reserve and you're getting receipts for the outward payments, then there's very little that can go wrong. And again, it's the fact of that accountability which keeps people in line. So dodgy treasurers are very unlikely to take on a treasury role in a group which has that kind of monitoring going on. And the fact that the file is there is enough to get the treasurer to toe the line. But it's absolutely a good example. Your example is very good of the fellowship can turn off the tap if necessary.
Does anyone have any other questions for Tim? I don't want it to be just me asking questions. You're sick of me. Anyone? I mean, even if it, if you're not sure, it's like a marginal sort of question that relates to your group or something like that. Maybe we could relate it to concept 7 or even just provide you with some wisdom of traditions that we've, or pain, misery we've been through with people breaking traditions in our home groups or whatever, Anyone got anything? I mean, I can keep asking other questions. Anyone else? No. Okay. So what do you think? Do you think is there ever a time when is there, so would you say there's times where there's a big emergency when conference isn't sitting and the trustees have to do something that is against the will of conference? Have you ever known that to happen, and what would happen at the end of that? Would they have to come and report back to conference, or what would they have is that possible if there's a big
I've never, I don't think there's been an ad hoc situation like that in AA in 30 years. There are, of course, things which need to be dealt with, but the board is big. There are a lot of people on it, and there are some competent people on it, and they just get on with it. Remember that conference is there to resolve, to make the final decision on large matters of general policy and finance. Policy decisions don't arise as an emergency; they just don't. There are questions which verge on that, but with some common sense, those are usually dealt with very adequately. So the best example I can think of is I'll do this with another fellowship, a non-AA one. One of the fellowships, when the whole that which shall not be mentioned started 3 years ago, absolutely didn't. The general service office of that fellowship did not get its arse in gear to putting online meeting details on the website. It just didn't do. It's incredibly difficult to get hold of them. You had to know someone to get the details. They would not publish it. Completely idiotic. AA did very, very well with this. Most places stepped up to the plate very quickly. But it's a good example. If you've got competent people who understand the fellowship and the needs of the fellowship, they'll just sort it. So the thing is, um, with policy, as I say, it's very rare for a situation to arise which requires a new policy decision. What you have is new situations which will require existing policy, like people want to be able to find where the meetings are. Can we make that happen? That policy is established. You don't need to revisit that policy. Exactly how you do that, you just get on with it. And then if it needs to be addressed at conference, it can be addressed at conference and tweaked. But things can generally be dealt with it. And that other fellowship did get its arse in gear in the end. It's notoriously cagey about personal details and putting meeting locations and things and so on. But even that fellowship got its arse in gear in the end. So things work themselves out.
We've got a
Anna.
question from Anna. Yeah. Great.
Hi, Tim. Anna here. Yeah, one time I was part of an organization that misplaced their bylaws and wanted to keep running. And I'm just wondering if we could relate that to Tradition 7. So what ended up happening was the organization hired, outside counsel to create a new bylaws document and ended up, voting that with the board. They'd been following their best of their recollection of the bylaws, but of course we couldn't, people couldn't remember everything. Some things are just lost to jargon or history.
One of the interesting points about the concepts is if anything were ever to be changed in the concepts, it's very, very difficult to change the steps, traditions, and the concepts. You'd have to have, I think, a 3/4 vote in favor of the change on the part of meetings globally, or maybe just American, Canada. I think it's globally though. So it's virtually impossible to change it. And changes, the way changes are supposed to be made, they're supposed to be made provisionally, so that the original word, everything is kept, the history is kept very, very carefully. So AA is very careful about that. And the history is very well recorded. We have archivists, it's one of the roles throughout the fellowship. And so that is but you raise a very interesting point about record keeping. So as a fellowship, we do very well. As far as groups, intergroups, and regions are concerned, it's a catastrophe. And people are reasonably good at producing minutes. So very, very good. You've got a nice set of minutes there for the latest meeting. But what you need apart from the minutes is a record of policy decisions which are made, which are to prevail in perpetuity. So most decisions which are made by, let's say, intergroup, have only a limited shelf life. They're only valid or relevant for a single occasion or for a few months or something. But if the intergroup makes a decision, for instance, regarding whether or not abstentions are counted and whether or not abstentions count towards the total somehow, whether abstentions count as noes, there's only one legitimate answer to those questions, by the way. There's only one answer that doesn't produce complete chaos. But if an intergroup makes decisions about those which are supposed to stand being, this is the way we do it, or for instance, on nominations and appointments, so whether you have to have a service CV, whether you have to be there in person to be voted in, whether you can attend electronically in an emergency to be voted into a role so you can get on with it. Those decisions which must then prevail in perpetuity, yes, it goes in the minutes, but it must go in a separate policies document, because then a good group, what it will do is it will record the minutes over here and then a policies document over there. And the policies document must be resent out to everyone whenever minutes go out, the updated policies document goes out. Then everyone is clear how we do things. So and the reason this is about concept 7. The reason this is about concept 7 is the conference, which is the voice of God speaking through AA, has the power of tradition. Now, for that tradition to apply, it must be known, made known, and recalled, which is why the record keeping is so important. If the records aren't kept, then that tradition dissolves. So the maintenance of a tradition, the application of tradition, is very, very tightly connected to a good record keeping.
Yep. Is that finished? Any more questions? I've got some more, but I don't want it to be the Robert show.
Well, it's not the Robert show, it's the me show. So I'm sure you're asking questions. I'm being facetious. It doesn't matter who the questions come from. Is the point. The point is the substance.
Okay. Sorry. Can you give us, if you want, I can give you one of mine, but an example or an example you've seen where someone has thought they've got to carry the weight of the whole fellowship on their shoulders, that they are God, and that if they do not run absolutely everything in this conference or this intergroup or this, it's gonna fail without me being across this because I am playing God. Can you?
Yes, it's very commonly done, and it's an absolute disaster. And if you're remotely competent, you'll go through that phase. Unfortunately, people who are incompetent go through that phase as well. It can so the answer to that is rotation. So it's a good practice not just to rotate out of service, but rotate out of attending a group for a while. Sometimes you have to rotate, even if you retain a little job like tea or something. Don't show up at the group conferences. Let other people figure it out for themselves. Don't show up at the business meetings. Let other people figure it out for themselves. Very important that you got to at some point you got to stop. And I've got myself into trouble by having my finger still in the pie when it should have left. One of the other things that there are some very specific examples in a country I shall call Mulvania. It's not Mulvania, it's another country, it's an actual country. The General Secretary has been in post for an extremely long time, and there aren't enough conference delegates, and the board massively outnumbers the conference delegates, so there is no mechanism in place. So it's very important for this to work. You've got to have a lot of conference delegates and a small number of board trustees. One of the dangers that can happen is that people defer to the voice of experience and wisdom. Now, they may well have lots of experience and wisdom, but people get too frightened to say things because the answer that comes back is, you wouldn't understand, you weren't here 12 years ago when this happened, or 20 years ago when that happened. And there are legitimate times that history is brought to bear on a particular situation, but it can be, what it can result in is that person having a stranglehold. And AA in that country as an organizer, the meetings are great in Mulvania. It's the service structure is an absolute catastrophe because the conference can't do anything because the General Secretary is in charge of the whole thing. What else happens with post-sitting? So a good example, many years ago, I went to a group where someone sat in post as the tea maker, and we'll call him Herbert. It wasn't his name. It was as ridiculous, but it wasn't Herbert. But the poor old Herbert, he was a lovely chap. I liked him enormously. He was a very particular gentleman. He liked things done a very particular way. And he did the tea, and he had it set up with the sort of biscuits stacked in particular ways, and he was very, very good at it. And no one wanted to take it on because it was Herbert's job. and even when they advertised it, so Herbert would step down. Herbert always said, "I'm very happy to step down." He would step down. Someone else would come into the post, and Herbert would mill around the coffee table and hover over them and make observations from his experience, and no one ever lasted. Very interesting. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a good handover. Don Fritz said that when you leave a role in AA, your primary obligation is to make sure that it's handed over so well that none of your experience is lost. This is why this is a concept 7. Concept 7 and tradition 12 go together. It is tradition which should be running this. It is the best practice that has developed over the years and the decades. That is what tradition is. It's not the opinion of a personality. It's a principle embodied in the tradition. So the job of those old timers or the long timers or the resident incumbents or whoever they are, their job is not to run things. Their job is to be the conveyors of what the experience is and what the tradition is, but then to let it go and let the decisions be made by the people that are actually doing the work. So that's why. So it was right here, concept 7 related. Anything else?
I could keep going on that. Sorry, one more. And look, has anyone got anything else?
I think they'll raise their hands if they will.
Just
I would
interrupt.
just
Right.
fire away.
So I had a situation in an unnamed fellowship with an unnamed person who they were from a professional background and they were a director and they were very skillful at using Robert's rules and parliamentary procedure. I don't know if you use Robert's rules in AA. I don't know if you used it, or it's parliamentary procedure anyway. They were very good at that. So their voice got and there's very similar. Their voice got heard more than anyone else's, and they would flatten issues with parliamentary procedure, so you wouldn't be able to get your point across on minority opinion. So it is parliamentary procedure or the way we run things more important, or concepts and traditions and steps more important? Which one's more important?
Well, that's a really, really good question. So I'm not sure this is a concept 7 question, but we're talking about it and it won't hurt because everything is connected really. You've got to have order. So discussion, vote, and substantial unanimity. The discussion must be an orderly discussion. For it to be the voice of the fellowship, the voices must be heard. So concept 4, there's got to be participation. Concept 5, there's got to be a minority opinion expressed, if relevant. And tradition 2, God must be allowed to speak through the group conscience, which means you have to hear some very uncomfortable things. You have to hear people that you don't want to hear sometimes. And to enable that to take place, one does need procedures. The trouble is with Robert's rules is they're designed for very sophisticated situations. I think that the best practice is to adopt certain elements of Robert's rules or some other set of rules so that you've got the orderly conduct of affairs. And examples of procedures which really help is I'll give you some. To bring up for discussion only that which must be brought up for discussion. So if something can simply be left to the officers to decide how to dispose of the question themselves, do it. If in doubt, err on the side of letting the officers get on with it, letting them be accountable to the group, and judge the situation based on the results. It's very rare that an experiment will have such disastrous consequences it can't be remedied. A good example is there's a group I go to where one of the questions is what with everyone pays electronically now. So a lot of people don't carry cash. When the pot goes around, not much cash goes in. And there's one treasurer, sometimes there's 40 to 60 people, there's one little card machine, and he's running around at the end trying to catch everyone, but people start to drift away, and then you tip over into the serenity prayer, and not everyone who wanted to pay with the card machine paid. And so the idea was, why doesn't the treasurer sit by the door on the way in saying, with a little sign saying, make your tradition 7 contribution here to help the group run, this is how much it costs. so that on the way in, when you've got half an hour before the meeting starts, rather than at the end with everything bustling around, you want to get to the newcomer and you want to go for fellowship, rather than doing that, why not just have the chap sitting at the front, or the chapess, or in this case it's a chap sitting at the front, and you've got time to collect it on the way in. I reckon you would treble the takings from the card machine, or quadruple the takings from the card machine. If people see that on the way in, they'll just pay. People are used to paying on the way in. The only things which you pay on the way out are AA meetings and clip joints. So have people pay on the way in. Someone explained that to the Americans later on. There are these bars in London where it's free to get in, but you have to pay to get out. There we go. That's what it can be like. Now, this doesn't need a group decision, I don't think. It's the treasurer's job to collect the money in a way which works. Why not try, rather than having a theoretical discussion about whether it would work, why not just try it for a month, see what happens to the takings? There you go. And if it works, you don't even need a decision then. Just get on with it. One of the dangers with this sort of Robert's Rules business is some people like things to be legalistic for the sake of it being legalistic. And too informal doesn't work, and too formal doesn't work either. So tradition 9 applies to this. Be no more organized than is strictly necessary. Have no more procedures for discussion than is strictly necessary. And frankly, it's very you can have an orderly discussion in a very simple way. You've got an agenda agreed in advance unless there's an emergency. If there are emergencies which cannot wait, they can go on to any other business. But for there to be an informed group conscience, you have the proposal and the background information circulated in advance, as happens with conference. Then you go through the agenda. And with the agenda, you have a topic, and anyone who wishes to speak can speak on the topic. You get one shot until everyone who wants to speak has spoken, and then you can only have a second pop with your view once everyone who's had the first pop has spoken. You can have exceptions for point of fact, which need to be brought to the attention of the group. That's a good exception to that rule. So if someone knows a specific thing which would change the discussion completely and stop it going up a garden path, then that's very helpful. And this is very good because it stops. I've seen, I presided over the group conscience of continental Europe region last, whatever it was, November, December, somewhere in there, in Budapest. And people started to discuss things in between themselves. So the discussion was going back and forth between two people in the room. So you have the discussion go through the chair. So you have to raise your hand and then be called upon. And so you've got 3 or 4 things there. Where if you do that, and you've got to have a chair that's willing to enforce it, to keep saying only through the chair. Can you pipe down over them? If Bobby and Charlie are chatting while Susie is speaking, Bobby and Charlie, you pipe down. So you have to have some procedures to run it, but not so many it becomes bogged down. One point about the personality in newer fellowships, this can be the case. In old fellowships in new countries or in new fellowships, very often the concepts are not being applied or haven't been voted on, for instance. If you don't have the system of the concepts, it ends up being the most powerful person that runs it, just the way it happens. There's a fellowship in the UK which is founded, I think, because of that. It looked as though it was going to take off the ground about 10 years ago, but it got bogged down because they refused to accept the concepts. And then it got bogged down because there were a couple of personalities that were in charge and put everyone else off taking part in the overall running. So yes, this is why I'm such a great fan of the concepts, is because they stop that behavior, because you have rotation, you have lots of other mechanisms in the place to ensure that everyone's voice is heard. And it's just gone 9. I've got time for one more question. I don't know anyone else. I've got time for one more brief question if there is one.
Any more questions for Tim? Well, I think we've comprehensively covered concept 7, which is what we achieved to do. So thank you, Tim, and thank you everyone for coming. And should we just sign off with the Serenity Prayer?